This is the Tri-State SARE Professional Development Project. It is funded through the USDA and Northeast SARE. It is a collaborative project among the universities of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Currently, we're in our second year of a 3-year project, and we're continuing our efforts on pasture-based systems for sustainable livestock production. This year, our webinar series in particular is focusing on
grant programs or resources that are available, please feel free to reach out to me Rachel, I think you can provide my email address, plus also my email address is available on the Northeast SARE website through the state of Connecticut information as well too. So without further ado, Rachel, I'll turn it back over to you for what I think is going to be a great program. Rachel?
Thanks, Joe. Up next, I wanted to hand it over to my colleague, Jean King, who is going to share with us a little bit more about the online discussion group that we'll be having following up all of our webinar series webinars. So, Jean, if you want to take over that piece.
Sure. What we're trying to do is do a follow-up discussion group among any of you who want to participate, all of you, without an actual presenter, but an opportunity for you to listen and talk with one another, as we often find that people like to do in the breakout groups or in other things, to share what's happening with you, or questions you'd like to know about other farms or other people who are working with farms. So this is going to be on Wednesday, April 9th from 10 to 12. It's a listening and discussion session. And hopefully maybe you could say what you already have recognized about climate change in your farm and what you think you're going to do next in the light of what's happening, what you see happening around you. And also, we hope that this is another way that you could connect with one another if you'd like to sort of say, here's someone I'd like to talk to, maybe offline, whose experience sounds like mine. So we look forward to having you all there. We do ask that you register online. It's the same place where you register for our other workshops, and we'll send you a link to participate. And if you would have something you particularly would like to hear about or discuss, then any one of you could email me and ahead of time and let me know, and we'll have a very rough agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. All right, so I think that's all the housekeeping pieces. I want to get into introducing our speaker today. She's joining us from Penn State. Leanna Dubstott is a field and forage crops educator with Penn State Extension. She's based in Bedford County and delivers local and some statewide programming based on producer needs, while also residing on a 200-acre farm with her husband and 3 girls, where they produce hay and have a small cow-calf operation. Leanna has a background in animal science and agronomy and focuses on pasture and grazing management, as well as other types of forage production, nutrient management, pesticide education, and agricultural water quality. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leanna, who will be focusing her presentation today on extending the grazing season, as well as including some annual forages. So let me just turn this here, stop sharing my screen. And Leanna, you can get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Let me get you can still hear me okay? I switched to earbuds just for my own sanity so that I can't hear outside office noise and be distracted.
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Let me swap that. All right, how's that?
Looks great.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started then. So good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Grazing and pasture management, of course, as you could kind of hear from my introduction, that's a passion of mine. So I really enjoy having these discussions. So I was asked to really, whenever Rachel and I were having a discussion, to talk about extending the grazing season, but really bring it back to the fact that like every growing season is becoming more and more different. We're having wet springs, we're having dry springs, we're having 0 rain in the middle of summer, where we would normally get a handful of thunderstorms, and it's making things a lot more challenging. And so just some things to think about and consider, and really just what we can do and why it's important to try and make our operations better and work well for us so that we can keep going and persist. So I titled it Grazing Season Strategies with Changing Growing Conditions. And so I'm going to start it off here with just a why is it important to try and extend our grazing season? And that's because our winter feed costs are really expensive, especially whenever we have those really poor growing conditions. And whether we're making hay ourselves or we're purchasing hay, if we don't have any hay that's growing to be able to harvest and bale, it bumps up that cost. We know how that works. So anything that we can do to prolong our grazing season, feed less of these stored forages, will really benefit us in the long run. So when we're thinking about all of our different options, so we have our cool season perennial pasture, like that's permanent, that's there, that's what we're working with. But what can we do on top of that to really boost our production or make sure that we kind of sustain our production for longer periods of time? So this is just kind of a brief list of some of the things, and I'll go over most of them in more detail. And it's not an exhaustive list either. So there are probably hundreds of other things that we could definitely try that we won't talk about today. One of those key things, though, that we'll talk about at the very end of this presentation today is knowing our forage inventory, because we really don't know what we need unless we know how much we need to, based on how many livestock we have and their needs. So I'm going to start first with rotational grazing. I'm sure many of you have heard of this concept. We all know what it is, but just to kind of discuss it a little bit. So it allows for that more managed removal of forage growth, whereas our continuous systems or that one open space, they have access all the time. But this really gives us this nice even regrowth. So if you look at this picture here on the bottom, this is where the cows are right now. We were actually them on a particular day, but you can see how nice and evenly grazed that is, and we're going to be moving them into the next paddock over here. And I'll show you another picture side by side with this a little later on. But this really allows us to maintain healthy plants. Our regrowth is going to be a lot better. We're going to have increased water retention. You've got a less access to directly to the soil here, so sunlight penetration, drying out that soil is going to be less of an issue. And when we're talking about particularly those drought scenarios, because that was a big problem we had last year, is we just had such a long drought. Where I am in southwestern Pennsylvania, we were D3 there for a good while. And so we just needed to be able to have that ability of our forages to retain as much moisture as possible. And we say the same thing here. So if you're looking at this, whenever you're grazing, if you are continuously overgrazing and have this really short stubble height all the time, eventually we're not going to be able to persist anymore, because those root systems are going to end up being so short and so shallow that they can't dig down to where any of that water would be during drought conditions. Something else to think about with forage removal, and I'll probably mention this a few times throughout the presentation, is mowing heights, stubble heights, whatever you want to call it. So whether this is hay or pasture, I know this is a pasture-based presentation, and so this works for either one. We want to pay attention to the stubble heights that we have so that we can allow our forage species to persist. We want to pay attention to the growing conditions that we have at this particular time. So if we are having good weather, good moisture, not too incredibly hot, we can usually go a little bit shorter if we want to. But if we are in a drought or going into a drought, or it looks like we're not going to have a lot of rain in the forecast moving forward, or just bad weather conditions coming in, we want to maybe increase that stubble height so that our grasses don't get hit so hard with that bad weather. And so this diagram here is just showing us the growth stages of our forages along the bottom here, and the relative quality y-axis over here. And we're always trying to hit this part here where our lines intersect whenever we're getting as much quantity as we can, while still trying to maintain a lot of that quality, because you can see that quality starts to decline as the forages age. So really, once things start to get seed heads, that's whenever quality really starts to drop fairly dramatically. So we're trying to hit that boot stage, maximize on quality, maximize on quantity. And I like to point out, get in too much of a calendar day type of scenario where like we're gonna graze or mow every 28 days. Try not to do that. Really pay attention to what the foragers are doing, so that you can do what's best in a case-by-case scenario and not just stay on a strict schedule. So this is for stubble heights. When we're talking about, and this works for grazing and mowing, because I have this conversation with the grazers as well, is we want to get as much off of there as possible. We don't want to leave any yield behind. So whenever we do high stubble heights, yes, we leave some yield behind, but we're kind of maximizing on that higher forage quality. All of that top growth has much higher quality than our stemmier undergrowth. If we do that as well, we're going to end up with some faster regrowth, and I have a video I'll show you next. We may have a slightly higher incidence of forage diseases depending on what the weather is going to do and just how much forage you're leaving behind. If we start to have those really moist, warm conditions, but we're also going to have a higher drought tolerance as well. If we start grazing or mowing too low, we're really going to stunt that regrowth. We're going to have lower stand persistence. Grasses tend to die out a lot faster than legumes. Our grasses store a lot of their energy in the lower portions of the stem, whereas our legumes have a crown that's at or below soil level, and so their nutrients are stored where they're not being basically bitten off. This is more for hay production. We may have some issues with increased ash content. For pasture scenarios, we may have more issues with parasite concerns, particularly sheep and goats. And then lower forage quality overall. More quantity, but lower quality because as you kind of mix that stemmier stuff with the leafier stuff, as a combined amount, that quality starts to go down. And so as long as this works, this is a video here. Maybe. There we go. From the University of Kentucky. It's a little old now, but it really still gives a good representation here of what continuous grazing looks like on the left at a 1-inch height and rotational grazing at a 3.5-inch height over 5 days. So this is just 5 days of growth. But you can see just how much faster that rotationally grazed grass is able to bounce back. And I want to liken it to the fact that, like, if we revert back to those drought conditions or weather conditions, where we may, like, everything stopped last year, everything turned brown. And if you had stuff that was grazed really short, even when that rain came back, some of this had either died because it just couldn't maintain itself anymore, or when it was trying to regrow, this was exaggerated even more, even slower. It just struggled to bring itself back. Whereas anything that we had maintained really well, took the animals off of, started feeding them supplemental forage, this bounced back so much faster. So all of that proper forage management, really important for our forages because it aids in longevity, standability, and resiliency. So that just ability for them to persist through any adverse weather conditions and just bounce back that much faster. So when we talk about some strategies for grazing, so overall goal here, maintain an optimum sward height based on your forage type. So based on whether you have tall or short grasses mostly in your pasture systems and what level of grazing they're able to tolerate. When I say tall and short grasses, I mean something tall would be like orchard grass or tall fescue. We want to graze those a little bit higher, 3 to 4 inches. Whereas something like our Kentucky bluegrass, able to tolerate a little bit of a shorter grazing, more like 2 to 3 inches. Same thing with grasses to legumes. Legumes or like our clovers, alfalfa, birdsfoot trefoil, able to tolerate a lower grazing. We still want to make sure we're paying attention to nutrient management, checking our fertility of those pastures, that good rotational grazing system, getting livestock to cover the surface area of your fields a lot better with manure and urine, aid in that even distribution, good fertility. Still checking our pH every once in a while, just making sure it's where it needs to be to give our forages everything that they need to grow properly. And so we're going to dive into some more of that managed grazing discussion here. So managed grazing, when I'm talking about it, is that we're controlling when and where our livestock are going to be consuming pasture. And we like this because it reduces that selective grazing pressure. So you can tell whenever you let livestock out into a paddock, especially whether it's continuous or maybe it's a paddock that's a little too large for the number of animals that you have, they're going to go in and pick the stuff that they want first. They want to go in and eat that really tender stuff. They want to go in and nibble off all the clovers, especially if you've got horses. They're going out there eating all the clover patches. But whenever we start managing that grazing, tightening it up a little bit, it really reduces that selective grazing pressure. You get that much more even graze and then regrowth as well. It also helps in that manure distribution, like I said, decreases parasite loads. A lot of times too, if you manage it properly, you may be able to increase your stocking rates or your carrying capacity, so you can actually add more animals onto your property, and it improves that longevity, like I said. And so 80% of what a livestock consumes is going to be returned back to that soil. And so here's the difference between those grazing systems. Like I said, you've probably seen these, but of course, continuous here, permanent outside fencing, access to everywhere. We start talking about rotational grazing is anytime we start to subdivide off sections of a field, whether it's just with temporary fencing like this, maybe these could be permanent fencing, maybe this one down the center is a permanent fence, and then these ones running horizontally would be temporary fencing that you can move or adjust depending on weather conditions or how many animals you have. But as soon as we start subdividing our pastures, that's when we're doing rotational grazing. Strip grazing, which I'll talk about a little bit more whenever I mention our annuals or stockpiling, this is whenever we start allowing them access to a particular field that we've maybe, like, let's do the annuals because that's the easiest. Maybe we want them to graze some annuals, but we only want them to graze pieces at a time. Because if you let a herd of cows or sheep or anything into a big field, they're going to run all the way across it, trample a bunch of stuff. So you want to limit the amount of space that they have at a time. And so this is what these are. These are just temporary fencing right here. And so you're just going to move the livestock one after the other. You can see here in this scenario, they've got back fencing up. And so back fencing is important if you would like to regraze this area. It's less important if this area will not regrow or you don't intend to regraze. And so here's that comparison I wanted to show you. We looked at this picture down here on the bottom already, but you can see here in this continuous scenario, so there's just much more grass and weeds left behind where they've gone through and kind of done all of that selective grazing pressure. And that's what I was trying to explain there. So when I'm trying to encourage folks to implement a rotational system, probably the hardest challenge we have is that we've got one water source and it's maybe in a weird spot. And so some of the things that I say is when you're putting up fencing, you can just divide a pasture in half, making it simple. Even just giving it a little bit of rest, moving them back and forth does a world of difference. And they don't have to be square. And so I think that's a conversation I have with folks too, is it is nice to have the nice square shapes just for ease of movement and it visually appealing. But it doesn't have to be. You can have these catty corner lines here so that you have this central water source here, but you're still utilizing the space a lot better. Something to recommend though is that it is more helpful if these areas are at least the same size in terms of acreage. That way you have a better idea of how long the animals will be in this space because you're used to that for each other paddock. But overall goal here is just pasture rest. Now, if you have multiple watering options, whether you have several areas where you've got a water source in the center, and maybe I have another field over here, same scenario, you can just start subdividing those in half, and then they can, same thing, just being able to provide access to that water from all the paddocks, subdividing, giving pasture some rest. Something else to think about, so we call this target grazing. You can see here we have this issue here with the water. It's the central location. They all have to converge on this spot a couple times a day, so you're getting a lot of hoof traffic, and you end up with this little bit of dirt lot. You can, if it's a permanent space, you can stabilize that area. If you have the ability to do some of the hose setups and move this to the opposite end of a field, that's an option as well. So just moving the feeder away. And so I think it'll be better explained when I show this image here. So here's our water source, one location. We also have a tree here, which we all know, especially in the heat of summer, we all want to kind of congregate to the tree and we're right next to the water. So some things that you can try and do, if we can't move the water, that's okay. If you can, that's great. I mean, move it to other spots, that helps out. But maybe if you're feeding some supplemental feed, maybe you've got a mineral feeder, if you move that to other areas within the pasture, just to force them to move to other spaces. Because, you know, like this area down here, especially on a hot day, isn't going to be utilized very well. So doing something or putting something down here to lure them into that space and provide that manure distribution. Something else that you could do is try to decrease paddock sizes. It definitely helps with that, them being, you know, lackadaisical and wanting to kind of congregate in one space all the time. Whereas if you're forcing them to only have certain sections of feed at a time, they're more likely to move away. So this was just some research here showing how much longer you can maintain your stocking rate on a set number of acreage just by implementing a rotational grazing system. So we were able to increase our grazing time by another week just by implementing some rotational grazing. And you can see here, these are compressed canopy heights. So this was a continuous field here on the left. This was rotational before they started to graze and rotational after they started to graze. So what's interesting about this is this was kind of, this is continuous. This is all the time. This is in centimeters here. This is what they had access to pretty much all the time that they were in there. Whereas you can see here, just here's that post graze. They had just finished this. We're going to move them into a new paddock, and just how well they utilize this compared to the continuous here. Because you remember when we continuously grazed, they left a lot behind. And all that stuff was able to mature, it got stemmy, they didn't want it as much, still got left behind, and so they weren't utilizing the pasture space nearly as well. So to wrap this up with the grazing, some common mistakes: grazing pastures too close, not giving them a chance to be able to regrow, rotating animals too quickly. So trying not to get on that like set schedule, really paying attention to forage regrowth, returning them before they've been allowed to regrow, at least 6 to 8 inches, preferably more like 12, before you move them into that paddock that you were allowing to rest. And something we see all the time is removing all those temporary interior fencing or opening all of the gates in the fall to just let them kind of clean up everything. Can really hinder you come next spring when they've kind of overgrazed certain areas, and you'll see that those spaces just don't regrow nearly as nice. So moving into one of the other strategies that we can have, so really none of the next few things that I'll talk about will work well unless you already have a rotational grazing system in place. So you really kind of have to have that to start implementing some of these other things. So this is so you want to grow annuals. Seems like it'll be relatively simple, but we've got to pay attention. So a lot of folks that want to grow annuals for feed, a lot of times are already growing some cool season annuals as a cover crop. But this is going to take a little bit of a different mentality here, because cover crops are there to help retain the soil, retain some nutrients, but we're not really looking for overall biomass there. We don't really need it to produce a lot of forage. We just need it to have that soil cover and that nice root structure underneath to hold everything in place. So we are going to have to actually pay attention to adding the nutrients that these annuals will need, making sure that's adequate to get the quantity that we want to have, making sure we're planting at the appropriate times, harvesting at the appropriate times, and just overall looking at species selection, what's going to work best so we can be successful here. And I'll talk about those a little bit more as we go on. So what's the difference here between our different types of annuals? So this green line here is our cool season perennials. And you can see here that we have a nice burst of growth here in the spring. We drop down in the summer slump, they don't grow as well. And then we have another little burst of growth here in the fall. This varies, of course, depending on the type of year that we have. This cool season here shut off a lot earlier last year than it has in previous years, just because it got so hot and dry very quickly. And so this is you're starting to see those shifts a little bit every once in a while. And even over here, our falls are kind of staying warmer a little bit further in, and these aren't turning on quite as early as they used to. So some of the things we can do here are cool seasons. They like it when it's cool. Our cool season annuals like those cooler temperatures. They can be planted when soils are about 45 degrees, and so they're planted down here somewhere, late summer, early fall. And then depending on how early you plant them, we can utilize them here at the end of the year or earlier in the spring than our perennials. And then our warm seasons, they like that to be nice and warm. So at least 60 degrees usually for soil temps. And then they'll still maintain that growth up to 80, 85 degrees, 90 sometimes, depending on what you have. And they'll really fill in this gap here for this lump, allowing us to have a forage to utilize then. So we're going to look at summer annuals first. And so what's nice about these, you can continue to graze them during the summer months. So have that increased production. I already mentioned our May is getting a little bit hotter. Our fall is staying warmer later. Our cool seasons may just be slowing down a little earlier than we anticipate them to. And so like we are starting to get the opportunity to maybe carry these into the fall a little bit more. So some of the summer annual options that we have, forage sorghum, and this is just kind of quick and dirty for some of these of the key highlights of each of the species. And this is not a full list. Of course, there are many other things that you could choose from. These are just some of the ones that get talked about, I think, the most often. So forage sorghum would be the one probably yielding right behind corn. What's really nice about forage sorghum is it uses half the amount of water that something like corn needs. So if you're already making corn silage to be able to feed, something like forage sorghum in years where we're having really poor quantity or we're having bad rainfall, this may do really well for you. So even if you want to do like a half and half corn planting, half forage sorghum planting, just to kind of cover your butts if we start to have some bad weather. Something else that's nice about this, I know over in where I'm from, southwestern Pennsylvania, we have a lot of deer. We have a lot of very small fields surrounded by trees. And so we constantly have that deer pressure coming in. At a farm like ours, we just can't grow corn. It's not possible. There's not enough corn being grown around us. And so you end up being that one feeding spot. And so something like sorghum, deer they don't care for it nearly as much. And so they leave it alone, which can be really nice. Sorghum Sudan grass is a hybrid of sorghum and Sudan grass. So Sudan grass has kind of declined in use since we started making these hybrids. What's nice about it is it does have lower prussic acid nitrate concerns than our Sudan. But this was created because we wanted it to be taller, stemmier, leafier, and higher yielding. And so the big difference here between forage sorghum and these two Sudan grass species here is that they will regrow and sorghum will not. And so sorghum is treated kind of like corn. It's a one and done. Whereas these guys right here, you get them planted early enough, have a really good growing season. You can graze that off and then you can come back in and you can graze that again. If you have too much at the end of the year, you could bale that, wrap it, and make yourself some really nice baleage to be able to feed during the winter months while giving them, because it can be a nice high quality feed. Something like millets, yield and quality going to be lower than our sorghum Sudans, and that's simply because it is a smaller stature plant. What's nice about them is smaller plant, more drought tolerant, and something else kind of interesting about them is we kind of have these constantly changing weather patterns. We're not always sure what's going to happen come fall, is that they're a little more cold tolerant. So if we start to get early frosts anywhere, they're going to tolerate it a little bit better than any of these earlier guys. Something like brassicas could also be used. They can be utilized as kind of a summer feed or a fall feed, depending on when you plant them. Really high quality, something you need to be careful with. Really good at weed suppression, nice big leaves. Any of these actually, especially sorghum Sudans and sorghum, all being very good at weed suppression. And like I said, late summer or winter grazing with them. So how are we going to utilize these? Grazing makes a lot of sense. It's cheaper than going through and having to mow it and bale it. And if you've already got the space to be able to do that, you've got some nice fencing infrastructure. Maybe you wanted to renovate an existing paddock in your pasture anyway. So planting these in the summer and then being able to no-till drill in a cool season perennial in the fall, that would work out really well. Something to think about, harvesting our warm seasons at the correct maturity. They tend to lose their quality really fast. And selecting varieties that work well for you and your area. If you're wanting regrowth, making sure you're picking something that will regrow well, and you harvest any extras if you want for some winter feeding. For some species with regrowth, residue height is important for animal health reasons. Nitrates accumulate in the lower portions of the stem, but also for the health of the plants. So these warm season annuals, much bigger plant, requires a much higher residue height or stubble height left behind compared to our perennials that we're used to in our pastures. So you're going to need more of a 6 to 8 inch height left over when you're done. So just some little caveats to think about whenever we talk about our warm season annuals. Really great feed, really high quality when you're harvesting at the right time, but we can have nitrate concerns, same that we can have with like our corn. It accumulates in that lower third of the plant, usually results from some sort of stress, like the drought we were having last year, excessive heat, hail, anything like that can kind of increase the nitrate concerns. So something to think about is just not over fertilizing. So a lot of folks were concerned about nitrates last year, but whenever we could talk to them about how much fertilizer they were actually adding, how much nitrogen they were putting in, whenever it's smaller amounts, the concern drops. And you can also have these things tested too, to see what your actual quantities are, because there's no way to know with just looking at the plant and paying attention to the weather. So it is something that needs to be tested. So to prevent nitrate poisoning, fairly simple. We're just going to follow those recommendations for nitrogen fertilization. We're going to leave more of that stem behind. So that lower 6 inches is usually worse. If we're really concerned about it, we can start bumping that up. You can also delay harvest until the stress has ended. So whenever we start to get adequate moisture, don't harvest it the day we get that rain or the day after. You need to give it a little bit of time to start to dissipate. And so giving it a handful of days, 2 to 4 days here is listed. Good sunshine, good growth coming back on. Millets can take a little bit longer than some of our sorghum sedans. Another thing that we could try is ensiling. So whether you have a silo that you can utilize, we could bag it, you can bale it and wrap it, but that reduces nitrate levels by up to 50%. So that can be really beneficial for some folks who are concerned about that. Maybe it's something we could have done like in the peak there where we really needed to harvest, but we were afraid to graze it. Maybe making that first cutting as some baleage so that we know that the feed was going to be safer, and then doing a graze later in the season. Prussic acid poisoning can sometimes be a concern as well. Typically more of a concern once we hit that period of time when we start getting frosts. And so it's a reaction within the plant. It's become damaged in some way, and it creates these cyogenetic compounds that happens at any of these sorghum species, not corn, Johnson grass, things like that. And so the problem being is that this is created, but the compounds are then converted to cyanide within the rumen of the cows, or within the rumen of any of our ruminating livestock. And that's where we can start to see some serious health issues, typically found in the leafier areas of the plant as compared to nitrate poisoning, which is in that lower portion of the stem. So to prevent prussic acid poisoning, so we don't want to graze our plants if they're stressed until they've been tested, just to be safe. There are labs that will test for prussic acid. Delay grazing, usually about 2 weeks, either until plants have recovered or they have grown 2 to 3 feet. We could cut it for hay. So cyanide is a gas, and so it dissipates over time. And so if we cut for hay and allow it to dry, that will dissipate that. Or if it has fully dried after a killing freeze, same scenario. Something else that you could do is, again, you could wait 5 days, harvest, and ensile for at least a full 8 weeks to make sure that that fermentation process has finished. Something else that you can consider, and that's the same thing with any sort of feeds that we're not sure are safe, is if you feed a safe pasture or a safe hay beforehand to reduce their overall consumption. They're not gorging themselves on something that could potentially be hazardous. Solution, dilution to pollution, we hear it all the time. And there are low to no prussic acid varieties available. And then the last thing here, before we jump into winter annuals, something to consider with brassicas. I already mentioned they're a very nutrient dense plant. Problem with that is you want to make sure you're feeding enough roughages, and we want to introduce them gradually and never more than like 50 to 70% of the overall diet, because it can just be too rough on them. Cattle tend to be a little more susceptible than sheep and can cause things like hyperthyroidism, poor growth, bloat being kind of a big problem. So just some things to consider. Like I said at the very beginning, with our annuals, management's going to be key, and you're really going to have to pay attention to them a little bit more than you would your perennial pastures. So moving on to, yeah, go ahead.
Leanna, sorry. Before, we have a couple questions, so I thought that maybe we could take a quick break and discuss those before we go into winter annuals.
No, that sounds good.
They're in the chat, and I can just read them off to you.
Okay.
Actually, our first question goes back to the initial part of the conversation with grazing. So
sure, that's fine.
We had someone ask, why would you not want the regrowth and not want to back fence when you were talking about your strip grazing?
So most of the time that is going to happen if we're grazing something like corn stalks, or if I'm grazing sorghum, because it's not going to regrow. It's not going to matter if they go back through that. If we are doing stockpiling, which I'll talk about later, that at that time of year in that season, it's not going to have any regrowth. It's too cold. The only time you would consider back fencing is if maybe we have some soil conditions that aren't conducive to a lot of heavy foot traffic. So if we're really wet, we may want to prevent them from going back and retrampling that area.
And then the rest I have on here are all in relation to your summer annuals. So
okay.
Can you use sorghum Sudan grass for direct grazing?
I'm assuming that we just mean like going through and doing strip grazing. Yes. So the best way to graze a sorghum Sudan or any of these annuals is to strip graze. And so you want to make sure that your hot wire is going to work really well. So a lot of times people will drive through a line with like a 4-wheeler or a mower or something like that, so that you have a nice clear path for your temporary fencing to go in. And then, yeah, you will just gradually move them along in a strip grazing fashion. Yep.
Great. Two more so far. And I should mention to everybody, if you have any questions for Leanna this far, certainly feel free to post them now and we'll get them all covered. Another one, Leanna, is can you drill these summer annuals into an existing pasture, or should each field be exclusively planted with just the annuals?
Yes, so I know some research has been done kind of off and on with this, some of it more formal, some of it like I know folks just trying to giving it a shot, really. So the biggest challenge we have with drilling it into an existing pasture without doing some kind of suppression is that if we do end up with like a drought scenario or just bad growing conditions, that existing pasture is already established, is a sod, and has a root system. Whereas that seed you're trying to drill in is just trying to get going. And so the existing sod will take a lot of that moisture away from that seed. So my best recommendation for that is you can put it into existing pastures, but we should suppress it in some way. You either need to overgraze the heck out of it. A lot of times we recommend trying to like a half rate burn down on it to just suppress it a little bit and not kill it. It does tend to grow better if you do put it onto a field where there's nothing else growing at the time, but it is definitely possible to do it in an existing pasture, but you have to suppress that existing forage to allow that warm season annual to actually start growing.
Wonderful. We have a couple more now.
Mhm.
Somebody's asking, are we trying to let the annuals go to seed, or should we be trying to reseed each year, the summer annuals?
You're going to want to reseed those each year. They're not the greatest at reseeding themselves. It would be if they did, it would be very spotty. But we need to get that good seed to soil contact. And so drilling those is the best way to actually get them planted.
And any thought on a mix of sorghum, Sudan grass, millet, and brassicas together, like King's Agri-Seeds Ray's Crazy Summer Mix?
Yep, I think that is a perfectly fine option to use as a mix. Like I said, these are all, I listed them as individual species, but anytime you want to combine them together, I know a lot of people will also throw in clovers, they'll throw in peas, things like that. Combining your tall species with things that have an understory and things that are vining and will climb some of the taller species. I know folks that'll put sunflowers in. Any of those are good options. You can mix anything. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then there was another question, but I can answer that one. Yes, we are going to share these slides at the end. All of the slides will be shared on our website, which I will send you guys again. And then now that you've also been part of our webinars, you are on our monthly correspondence emails, which is where we will update everybody once things are posted, our recording and the PowerPoint presentations. So yes, for sure, you will have access. Just 1 second, something else came in. I just need to read.
You're okay.
Okay, so last question. Most of my pasture areas have no shade. Do you know of any affordable, easily movable shade solutions? Something one person could move every 3 or 4 days without a tractor.
Man, that is a hard one. I don't know anything off the top of my head. That is a question that you get a good bit. I get a good bit every once in a while from folks. It's amazing how well livestock are able to tolerate the heat of the day if they have plenty of forage that they're able to graze during more in the morning and more in the afternoon. They can lay down and relax during the heat of the day. They're ruminating. So when they have plenty of forage to be able to sit down and ruminate, that's always a benefit. I don't know of something off the top of my head. I know some folks, when they know the weather is going to be bad, they'll try and utilize a paddock that maybe is along a tree line to try and provide some shade. Every once in a while, if the temperatures are very, very warm, and I'm talking like up in the 80s, 90s, they'll allow them some access to a barn. I know those may not be exactly what she's looking for, but I unfortunately don't know any good solutions for that. I know it's a challenge.
All right, so that's all that we have at the moment for questions,
Okay.
but certainly I'm trying to encourage everybody to continue posting your questions in there. We will take some time for pausing after the winter annual discussion before we go into some more discussion if you guys have anything. So Leanna, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, yeah, yes, please interrupt me at any time. Sorry about that. I should have had maybe a better stopping point. But okay, so we'll jump into winter annuals here, and we'll start to move fairly quickly because I see we're creeping up on kind of when the agenda said we should move on to inventory. But so for winter annuals, we just want to make sure that we're choosing the species that's going to work for us: soil type, drainage, what pH we have, what temperature so we typically have through the growing season. What helps with these is it really stretches that supply of high quality forages over that longer period of time. Our winter annuals, cool season annuals, I might use that phrase interchangeably. They're very high quality feed, which really helps to stretch that supply later into the fall and getting us a good graze first thing in the spring. You can, if we're grazing this, if you're mowing it off, I try not to recommend this because we really want that maturity to line up with each other so that we have a uniform quality bale. Now, if you're grazing it, you can mix early maturing species with late maturing species, and it really kind of prolongs the feed supply that you have. And including legumes helps with increase the quality as well. Our legumes are a little bit higher quality, so any of our clovers or alfalfa, and they're also good at nitrogen fixation. There we go. So some of the popular winter annual options, rye being one of the most popular and probably most talked about, aside from maybe triticale. So it's a very early maturity. So it's one of those ones, if you get it in early in the year, you may be able to graze it fairly quickly. It's our most cold tolerant. It's also very drought tolerant, which is really beneficial. And the growth is very fast. Wheat, not quite as productive as rye, a little bit later maturing, but still has that drought tolerance. And then triticale is that combination of wheat and rye. It's a hybrid. It's as productive, but is going to be later maturing than our rye. Barley is not going to be as winter hardy, and it's less productive than wheat. And our oats, again, we're going to have that poor cold tolerance, but you may get a lot of biomass out of that if you plant it earlier in the year. And so trying to find that balancing point of when do I really need to have this feed? Do I need it in the fall or do I need it more in the spring? This was just some interesting research here, done a good while ago now, but it was up in New York. And so looking at planting dates and yields. And so our yield is right here on our y-axis and our planting date is across the bottom. And it's just showing that the earlier in the year that you can get your forages, your cool season annuals planted in the ground, the higher yielding they will be in the spring. So doing our best to kind of plant them as early as we can. This is challenging for folks who are growing corn for grain and depending on how long it takes them to get that corn to maturity and when harvest happens. So it is a challenge and a balancing point. For folks who are just grazers, this may be a little bit easier to accomplish. Some of the folks that I talk to who are grazing or who have livestock and are producing warm season annuals and want to kind of have something in its place during the winter months are kind of looking at this where they planted a warm season annual and a lot of times they just take it to frost and then they'll take it off and then they'll get that cool season in the ground. But that can be fairly late in the year. And so we're maybe not getting, we're not maximizing the amount of production our cool seasons can have by doing that. So what we've been saying is our warm season annuals are not going to produce much after our soil temps drop below 50 degrees. So at that point in time, do that last graze, mow it off to make baleage, mow it off to make dry hay if you want to, and then get your cool seasons in the ground so that you can really maximize the amount of biomass you're going to get out of those as well. You can also summer seed these small grains. Rapid establishment really helps increase overall forage quantities. You may need to increase your normal seeding rate because we're going to want to use this as a forage. Even higher if you're broadcasting it, because remember, we like that seed to soil contact. Seeded by September 15th will get you that fall grazing that you want. Wheat and rye, planting them later for spring. You can put these right in after corn silage for a lot of folks. That's the easiest. One last thing to consider here is just paying attention. All I want to point out here is just paying attention to what life cycle your livestock are in. Are we at maintenance because our crude protein needs or our nutrient needs in general are going to be lower as compared to lactation, as compared to pregnancy. So just knowing the nutritive value of these feeds that you're going to be growing to make sure you're lining up well with the livestock you're going to be feeding. And then species selection is really important. So for Penn State, we have variety trials and we run at 2 locations, one in Central PA and one in Southeast PA, to try and get as much of a feel for different climates as we can. It's challenging for those in the North and the Southwest a little bit, but checking the variety trials to see what's growing best in your weather conditions, what their fertility needs are, what risks there might be, and talking to your extension agent who has run these trials to ask them questions about these. And talk to your seed dealer. Ask them what options they have. Pre-mixed can be really good options, but occasionally they can cost a little bit more. But there are great options out there. Okay, any other questions come in? I'm going to jump into stockpiling.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I do have one, Lana.
Okay.
How much time do you recommend from the seeding to the first grazing with perennial grasses?
With the perennial grasses?
Right.
Okay. That can be challenging only because I want them to get to that 8-inch height, at least, at a minimum. So usually between 8 and 12 inches high. The challenge with grazing is livestock are biting and pulling a lot of times. And so we don't want to accidentally rip a small seedling out of the ground. Mowing, you can get by with it a little bit sooner. Grazing, you need to wait until it's usually that, 6-8 inch height at a minimum. And you can even check too if you want to walk out and kind of tug on the plants and see if they easily pull out of the ground. That's a good check as well.
That's all I have at this point.
Okay, we'll jump into stockpiling then. So here's that kind of calendar again. And so stockpiling is this yellow here. And so it's got to kind of overlap a little bit with where our cool season annuals are. Really, the goal is to just be able to graze our existing perennial pastures later into the year. Oops. There we go. So whenever we're wanting to select a species, the important thing here is we want leaves that retain after a frost. They're going to need to grow well in cool temperatures. They need to be just a hardy type of species in general. And so a lot of our good options tend to be tall fescue kind of being that number one, smooth bone grass, orchard grass, timothy, and reed canary grass, which is being used a lot less often. So I should probably just take that one off the list. But those first three there being the most commonly used. So here's that tall fescue stockpile. It's the best adapted one, even after a frost, well into winter. If you're seeing a lot of those grasses out in a field that's still green, majority of the time it's tall fescue. It retains green leaves for a very long period of time. It's high yielding, it's tolerant to grazing, it's palatable, especially after we start having those periods of frost. Because if you've ever looked out in a field in the summer and you see those green patches left behind, that's tall fescue as well. It's coarser, it's a little rougher. Livestock tend to avoid it a little bit if they're not overly used to it. But after we have that frost, the leaves kind of become a little more tender and a little more palatable. And this is especially important for like sheep and goat scenarios. They will not touch it at all until it's had a frost. And then something like orchard grass or smooth brome, slightly higher in that nutritive value than tall fescue, but less persistence as we go in years following, just because they're not quite as hardy whenever you're kind of beating them up a little bit during those winter months. Management for stockpile. So you want to select a pasture or a field that can handle winter foot traffic. So if you've got kind of a low-lying field that likes to sit wet, this would be a really poor candidate for stockpiling. Earlier in the season, we're going to want to clip or graze and do our final graze at the end of fall, before the end of the fall growing season, because you want to give it time to start to accumulate its regrowth. So we're going to do a graze 70 to 90 days before we would typically stop grazing. We're going to add a little bit of fertility to this to kind of boost production. It's not always necessary depending on the fertility of your particular field. You could do a soil test to see, but this would really help boost your production to get as much as you can out of it. Allow that forage to grow for that 70 to 90 days and then start to graze, and you'll have something that looks kind of like this. Or like this, where we start to have snow on the ground. Maintain a higher residual height, that 4 inches, and that's simply because we're kind of beating it up in the middle of winter here, and we don't want to graze it too short. We can utilize some strip grazing. We don't need back fencing unless we're concerned about compaction. And you could also stockpile some hay fields as well, which is really great for return of nutrients. And you could overgraze only if you plan to reseed that particular field in the spring. I have bale grazing next. I'm going to briefly talk about it because I know your next session is on bale grazing. And so it's just the strategic placement of some bales so that you can utilize that in the winter months. And so we do it because it allows for this nice even distribution of manure, lower labor, reduced need for sacrifice areas, improved livestock health. And the thing that I want to point out based on, for my part of the conversation today, is this increased water holding capacity. So whenever we incorporate bale grazing, it's adding all of that extra organic or all of that extra forage. We're leaving it behind. So the whole point in this is not to have the livestock come and completely clean it up. We like this picture here. Now this may be stressful to some people because it feels wasteful, But the whole point here is that we want to improve the fields and increase our forage production over time. And so as we do this, we increase the amount of organic matter. We're going to have better water retention. And so when we start to have these really challenging weather conditions where it is hotter and drier, the more our soils are able to retain as much moisture as possible will work in our advantage. And so you'll feel the pressure of that drought scenario a lot less than maybe some other folks would. And so that's really what I wanted to point out there. And to help increase forage production. So yes, we may have these horrible patches the year after, but then as we move into years 2 and 3, you're going to really see that increased forage production. And increased forage production is really the name of the game if we're trying to graze as much as we can. And so that's all I'll talk about that, because like I said, I know you'll talk about it again. Some other things that we could consider during poor weather conditions, maybe we could graze some of our hay fields. It's less wear on our equipment, it's less labor. We get to add nutrients to those hay fields, increase the organic matter like we want to, because we're getting all of that extra manure coming in. The one caveat I say with this is that if you're like me and we also sell some of the hay that we make, I don't want to do this on a field where we're going to need to sell it, because we always worry about the manure patties not breaking down quite enough. And so that could be a concern. But it is a really easy way to stockpile, because you've kind of gone through your whole hay harvesting routine. You've got some regrowth on them. Might as well utilize it, right? Also making sure you have some good exterior fence or livestock who are respectful of a hot wire. And then one of the last things I'll talk about here is grazing crop fields. So we had a lot of scenarios last year where we had very poor grain corn. A lot of them just didn't get any kernels at all. So there was no fertilization of those corn ears because we were in such a poor drought. We had a D3 drought. And so some folks were trying to graze these instead of taking them off of the combine because it wasn't worth the time or the equipment being moved in and out. And so that's also an option. But you can also go and you can plant corn and just simply graze the stalks if you want to. Just making sure you're checking the nutritive value of those corn stalks to make sure you're balancing out the needs for your livestock. And so really that's what we're trying to do here. We're just trying to fill in this calendar with as many options as we possibly can to extend the grazing season and graze as long as possible. And some last things, never a one-size-fits-all solution. That's the fun part about this job, is that every scenario is going to be a little bit different, and it's fun to kind of work through strategies that are going to work for each producer. And you tailor those to meet management goals. Looking at species selection, whether that's livestock or the grasses, and then looking at the grazing management setup. How can we make it work for you? And it is a time management thing. We got a lot of part-time farmers. We got to be able to move animals when we have the time, and we want to maximize animal performance as well. So that leads me into the forage inventory. The next section of this is going to be about forage inventory. So like I said, we're kind of coming into these weather patterns where we, I use last year as an example only because it was a very strange anomaly where we haven't been that dry in a very long time. But we were trying to feed hay in the middle of summer that we don't normally have to do. Even for some of my good rotational grazers in the area, they had to feed some stuff. This combined with proper storage, and the reason for proper storage is we want to maintain that quality, we want to maintain palatability, we need to know the needs of our livestock, growth stages, development, average weights, and so that's something that you can see here because we have a dry matter intake as a percentage of our body weight, depending on what point they're going through. So like lactating use here, 2.5% to 4%, whereas use at maintenance would be just 1.8% to 2%. So much lesser amount of dry matter needed. And then we want to make sure we're identifying all the different forages that are available on our farm. And so we're looking at our perennial pasture, the pastures that we use all the time. We're going to look at any areas that we may stockpile any possible hay fields that we might utilize, any annual forages, whether that's our summer annuals or our winter annuals, and all of our stored forages, hay, baleage, silage, anything that you may have. And this is, I'm talking strictly about forages. There is a section on the spreadsheet I'll talk about that has any supplemental feed that you might be giving as well. So for calculating forage inventory, we want to do this on a dry matter basis. And the reason for that is from this exact same thing that I showed you on the first slide, is it helps when we're looking at the dry matter intake needs, because we know that dry matter intake is a percentage of body weight per day. And so we can either do this, you can send your forage away to any of the labs and they'll strictly test for moisture. But probably the easier way is to either use a coster tester, which is something like this, where I'll put my forage in here, stick it on the dryer, and weigh it every so often until the weight remains stable. Or I'll do the exact same thing in a microwave, where you just stick it in the microwave and you start cooking it until it no longer loses moisture anymore. And there's your percent moisture. You reverse that, that's your percent dry matter. So I'm going to talk about all different types of forage inventory here, just to kind of give you an overview of what's involved. But whenever we do the spreadsheet, we'll strictly be looking at pasture inventory. And so something like silage, I think it's becoming a little bit more popular in terms of this bag variety here, because some of the beef producers won't have silos existing, and so a lot of them are starting to use the bags. I think a lot more people are starting to utilize wrapped bales, and so similar thing, just in a bale form. So for something like silage in a bunker, you're going to need to calculate length, width, and height of the forage. And what's nice about these is there are a lot of calculators online from different universities that will convert that volume of silage to a weight, which is usually about 14 to 15 pounds of dry matter per cubic feet. For the uprights, you're going to need the diameter of that silo and the height of the forage that you have in there. Something to remember, and I have a quick thing to show you, is that the density will increase as you move down the silo. There's more weight pressing down on the lower portion of that silo, so the density will be a little higher. Ag bags, like something like this, is just length and diameter. What's nice about these is packing density is usually pretty consistent along the length of the tube, but it may change based on the type of silage that you are putting into the bag. Drive overs, usually for much larger operations, whenever you don't have a bunker. And what's hard about these is you no longer have the nice concrete walls of a bunker making it square. You need to now have the height and length, and also the slope and the shape of the exact shape of that pile. Otherwise, the density estimate is similar to a bunker, but it is a challenging one that you would probably need to work with somebody who has done it before, or your local agronomist, to try and calculate that a little better. Hay, one of the pretty simple ones, you need the average weight per lot of hay that you make. So each field that you do, for each day that, like if you separated the field into two and baled it on 2 different days, you're going to want to do the average of like this first day that you baled and the next day that you baled. You put them into lots because they're going to be the most likely, and then you can average that across everything you have and multiply it by the number of bales that you have total to figure out how much dry matter you have. Now this is looking at those silos. So just to kind of show you, upright silos will be packed tighter at the bottom. So if we're estimating that 36 feet on a 20-foot diameter silo, we're going to estimate that there's about 242 tons available. When we remove 20 feet of silage, so moving back up here to this height of silage, we're going to say that we removed about 105 tons, which means that there's about 137 tons remaining, which is more than this 77 listed here. And that's because it's much more dense. And so we know that there's more in there. For something like the bag, they have these tables here, assuming a 13-pound dry matter per cubic density. If that's not the density you have, they do provide nice conversions here. And so you would just come down, look at your length, look at your diameter, and it'll give you a pounds of dry matter capacity in those bags. Now for something like pasture, this can be a little bit more complicated sometimes. The most accurate way would be to do some hand clipping, which is also the most time consuming and sometimes the least possible for a lot of people. But it involves going out, clipping from a little square here, putting it in a bag, drying it down, figuring out how much you have. And when you're doing this, you're kind of doing it in a zigzag pattern across your fields. Something like a pasture ruler will relate height to yield, average being about 300 pounds per inch. And so this is from Pennsylvania NRCS. I think a lot of other state NRCS places will have their own tables that they use. If they're still using the table method, some states are a little bit different, but you can use this to kind of get an estimation of how many pounds of dry matter per acre are out there. And then something like a rising plate meter, it measures bulk density, typically used a lot more in research, but I think being less and less used. This was just a quick, hay became a great concern for a lot of people and making sure that they had enough. And some folks wanted to suddenly start making their own hay. But if you already don't have the equipment, it is a big investment. And so looking at just kind of the comparison here between what it means to purchase hay and what it means to make hay. So if you're purchasing hay, you don't have the issues with maintaining that equipment. You don't have to worry about how much land you have and how much hay you actually have to make for your animals. Good for busy schedules. You're not out there trying to time the weather just right with your work schedule to make sure you can get out there. Things like that. And you can always kind of search for the exact hay that you want. Whereas if you're making hay, you've got that maintenance. You need some flexibility to make quality hay. Now, and you got to have larger storage facilities as well, because you're kind of making that hay like through the summer, and then you need somewhere to put it all. Whereas if you're purchasing it, you can purchase smaller quantities at a time. And so just some things to consider. People are always asking me what the price of hay is, how much it would cost to have somebody come make the hay on their own property. And so there is information out there, like the National Agricultural Statistics Service, or NASS data, provides a lot of commodity information, land rent information, and they even have these machinery custom rate reports to kind of give you an idea of that. And then for hay prices themselves, looking at your local auctions, there's a lot of Facebook pages out there, just simply word of mouth, talking to your neighbors, things like that. And then one of the last things here, for checking with local agencies for what kind of checking with local agencies on what kind of resources that they would have on hand to be able to assist you, to be able to implement some rotational grazing systems, help you with your water supply, to be able to spread that out throughout your acreage that you have. FSA sometimes provides some disaster relief programs. Conservation districts can also help with a lot of similar things that NRCS can. So just kind of looking through all those. And then this was kind of a funny thing that I did with the some presentations that I had before, but when you're talking about farming, you want to have a plan. You want to go into things with a plan. However, you also need to have that adaptability to completely scratch that entire plan, move on to the next idea, and then the next idea, because it's going to throw curveballs at you. You're going to have this muddy mess. You're going to have a bunch of snow cover. You're going to have that grass turn completely brown. You're going to have an frost and worry about your annuals, all sorts of things. So again, a recap of that, there's no one size fits all. Weather is unpredictable, and you just need to have that adaptability and the ability to just kind of roll with the punches for farming. And that's all I have for that. And so I will stop. Well, actually, I don't need to stop that, but I'm just going to switch to the Excel spreadsheet. However, are there questions before I move into the spreadsheet?
One just popped in. So it
Okay.
says, in which situation would you recommend doing haylage?
I think haylage is a great opportunity to have that nice stored high quality feed. I think haylage is also a great opportunity whenever you have weather conditions that aren't conducive to making dry hay, because that happens. And I think that's why a lot of folks in my area, haylage and baleage, I think it's used sometimes interchangeably. Baleage, when I talk about it, is the wrapped marshmallow bales that are out there in the field. Haylage is just any sort of, you're using some type of grass aside from corn. But yeah, I recommend it for just about anything. I think if you've got feeders that you're trying to fatten up, haylage is a really great option. I think, yeah, you have bad weather conditions and you can't get your hay to dry, you could do a haylage because you don't have to let it dry nearly as much. So things like that. And if you have more questions on top of that, hopefully that answered it enough.
I don't see anything else at this point, but
Okay.
I'll let you know if I see more.
Okay. All right, so let's switch here. Here's the spreadsheet. Can you see that all right?
Yep, look good.
Okay. And Rachel did mention that I have it zoomed in about as far as I can go on my computer without it being awkward to scroll between tables, but you can zoom in on your own computer if you need to. So I was going to walk through this scenario here of calculating our forage inventory in pasture. And so I don't know if it's going to be easy to actually have people pop things into the chat just because there's a decent handful of you and waiting for a response. So I do have a scenario here that, so if you don't mind me, I'm going to flip through and then we can kind of talk about it if people are willing to do that. Okay, so this is a table that was created by one of the centers that we have up at the university. Whoops. And it's our Center for Agricultural Technical Assistance Training. And it was made because Pennsylvania has the ACAP program. And we were just trying to create a nice flow Excel spreadsheet to be able to calculate this. You can do it all by hand, but this is going to kind of auto-populate some of the math for us. And I think some of the resources I sent to Rachel have those calculations written out, so you'll have access to those later. So with this table here, first thing we're going to do is we're going to choose what type of animals we have. And we're just going to go with beef animals because they're kind of one of the simplest here. And then we want to look at average weight. And so there's a note here that says we need to see table 2. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to this slide here. And this is our table 2 down here, right here. And so I'm going to say that I have a cow-calf operation. And so I've got a mother with young, and it's a beef. And so that's 1,400 pounds average. And this can vary. If you have the exact weights of the animals on your farm, that's kind of the best way to do this. But tables like that will give you a general idea. And so I'll type 1,400 in here. And I need to know what's my dry matter intake of my cow. So I'll go back to my tables here. And it said to do table 1. And for beef animals, it averages about 2.5. And so I'm going to take that 2.5. And I'm going to pop it into here. Okay. And then I'm going to keep this fairly small. I'm going to say we have about 20 animals. And so that means my daily forage demand on a dry matter basis is 700 pounds. And so you can see here down in table 2, it has brought that down, that 700. If I'm feeding any supplemental feed, like grain or anything like that, I would add that in there because I would want to subtract that from my forage needs because I don't need quite as much dry matter per day if I'm also supplementing some feed. But I'm going to skip that for this one, and we're just going to assume this is a strict grazing scale with no extra supplemental feed. And now we're going to come down here and we need to, so that's how much we need for our livestock. I want to estimate our forage supply. And so now I need to know, what am I growing? Sorry, these are very tiny when I do the drop down, I noticed. But we'll just pick something simple like orchard grass. And then I need to know how many pounds of dry matter per acre this is actually producing. Now, you can go out and do the hand clipping and drying if you really wanted to. Otherwise, you can use some of these tables that are provided. And so I'm going to go over here. I'm going to find my orchard grass, and I'm going to look across this line. And so across the top here, I've got good, poor, and overgrazed. And for me, I'm looking at my pastures thinking, I'm somewhere between good and poor. And so I want to put 5,000 here. Okay. And then I'm going to say that I have 30 acres of pasture. And so this is how much dry matter I actually have available now. And so if you have multiple fields, multiple forage types, you can go through and do that for all of these. You can do it with grass legume mixes. And you can then have a total of all of the forage that you have available out on pasture. And so now we will look at our forage animal balance. And so here's that forage demand. It's brought down again. My grazing period, I've decided that I would like to graze as long as I can throughout the year. In Pennsylvania, for me, that's roughly 6 months. We've got about 3 months in winter there where it's pretty darn hard to graze unless you're a really good manager, or we had a really mild year and not as much snow. It didn't get cold quite as fast, things like that. And so this grazing period here needs to be in days. So for 6 months, it's 180 days. Get out of the way here. And this is pounds of dry matter per acre needed. And then little stinker didn't drop down, so I'll add him in here. There we go. So this 150 here is supposed to pull down from this 150 total we have here. And then our utilization rate. And this is going to be on table 4. And utilization rate is based on how long an animal is in there. And so I'm going to say that I kind of want to rotate every weekend. I work off the farm, and so I want to rotate every weekend. And so that's going to be the 6+ days here, which means that I'm going to get 60% utilization out of those fields. And so that's where I'll put this here, and I'll put 0.6. Okay, so you can see here we have a parenthesis. So this actually means that we have a deficit happening. And we'll come back to that. But in the meantime, I want to still continue calculating a couple more of these things, like our paddock sizes and how much acres are required. So again, our demand has dropped down here. And that 60% utilization there was 6 or so days. And so that's where that 6 can go. Pounds of dry matter available per inch is on another table, table 5. And so this is estimated forage yield, dry matter per acre per year, and that forage yield per acre inch. And so that's what it's asking for. And so I said that I had a field that I thought was roughly 5,000 pounds of dry matter per acre per year. That equates to 170 for our yield per acre inch. And so that's where that number comes from. And I have to put that 170 in here. And then we've got inches available. Again, it has a note here that we need to use table 3. So inches of available forage equates to the turn-in height minus that removal height. And so up here at table 3, turn-in height minus the removal height. And so I'm going to say that I put them in at 8 and I took them out at 4, which means that that number needs to be 4 inches. Okay. So this is how big our paddocks should be, about 10 acres each. And for about 20 cows, that seems about right. Now, this comes down here and starts to auto-populate the number of paddocks that we would actually need. And so this is based on a 20, 30, or 60-day rest. And we divide it by the number of days I want them in there, and we always add 1. That's just the way this equation goes. And then it tells you how many paddocks are actually needed. And then this step is the number of acres that we need. And so again, with a 20, 30, or 60-day rest, you can see here that the number of acres greatly increases the longer days of rest that we want to give those fields. But, and you can drop this in the chat. What do you notice about this 44.6 based on where we started at the beginning? So even with just the shortest rest we can get, we're at almost 5 acres. So if you want to pop it into the chat, what problem do you potentially see with that value right there, if you were following along? So if I scroll back up here, clear the top, and I'll give you guys, there we go, I saw it. So yeah, yep, more acres than what we have. You gotta give people time to type, but yep, see, there it is. So right here, I said that I have 30 acres. And so what this calculation is telling me is I need 45, which is 15 acres less than I can to sustain this. So go ahead and throw this into the chat. What do you think? And there's at least 2 good options. What do you think I could do to fix this? Yep. So reducing my stocking rate could be one. So I could come up here and I could cull a handful of these cows. Maybe I don't need 20. Maybe I drop this down to 10. Oh, I like the leasing additional land one. So I need to maybe try and get more land. And then, yep, rotate more frequently. So I like that one. And I'm going to come down here. And if I take, so remember I had that table there that had my utilization rate right here. And so I said I want to rotate every weekend, but that's only 60% utilization of that field, right? So what if I start doing every 2 or 3 days and then I get up to 75% utilization? So something simple like that. So I'm going to change this to 3, my residency period, 3 days, and I'm going to change this to 0.75. And then I'm going to scroll back down here to the amount of acres I need, and now I'm at 31.6. So really gosh darn close to that 30 acres that we actually have. There are some other things that we could start doing. I like here that we say confine and feed during times when forage is low. That's always a good option. You don't want to overgraze, so making sure you're just bringing them off, feed some supplemental feed so you get that regrowth back, supplementing with hay. And then, yeah, this is that more frequent moves, smaller paddocks, increased utilization rate. So just simply rotating them more often to increase utilization, we'll be able to increase that or decrease the amount of acreage that we actually need. I hope that all makes sense with everybody. I will confirm with the creator of this Excel spreadsheet that I can share it. Otherwise, I would love to share it with you. Yes. Any other questions for this? Because that's about all I have for that sheet. And that's one of the more, like I said, pasture calculations are one of the more complicated ones. It's much easier to have all of this hay stored and know how many pounds or tons you have. Hay or pasture calculations can be a lot more complicated. And like I said, if you have multiple different types of livestock, you want to come up here and make sure you're incorporated. Like maybe I have beef and I follow up graze with some ewes and start adding in all of that information and doing the same thing with them.
Does anybody have any further questions for Leanna at this point? If she confirms that she can share the table with everybody, that will be coming out through our monthly correspondence. So we do send out an email about once a month that just kind of updates everybody, the same email I was mentioning earlier on in the webinar. So certainly keep an eye out for that, because that's how we would share this table.
Yeah. And I know doing math problems like this, especially on a webinar, is tricky to to follow along. And so being able to go in and play with it yourself would be nice. So yeah, if I can share it, I'd love to do that. Of course, I think a lot of extension for each state, a lot of times we'll have some calculations and things available as well to do them out by hand. And if you're really tech savvy and you want to play with Excel, you could just make your own Excel spreadsheet just like this. I have some folks that are pretty adamant about it, and they have some pretty extensive Excel sheets. And I'm happy to take questions about anything we talked about today if we haven't covered it already. I know we're a little early.
Give everybody a minute to type. All right, Brendan says he has a question about the annuals. Brendan, you can either type it in or happy to have you unmute yourself and you can just ask.
Hello, Leanna. So
Yeah.
with the annuals, I'm wondering how that works within the bigger picture. Would we have a few paddocks that are annuals mixed with other paddocks that are perennial and annual mix? Is there, what are the main reasons why we would put in paddocks that are annuals?
So the main reason for that being that we're trying to extend the amount of grazing that we have. Maybe I want a higher quality stored forage, so I actually plan on mowing it and storing it. A lot of times folks are starting to incorporate annuals because they need to renovate their existing perennial pasture anyway. And so they can officially terminate their perennial field, plant in these cool seasons, get a growth off so the way that they would a lot of times do it is either put a cool season in or not, but a lot of them will terminate it, put in a warm season so that they can then plant a perennial in the fall, because that tends to be the best time to be able to plant our perennials. At least I know Pennsylvania is. I think down in the Connecticut, Delaware area it is as well. And that's simply because the weather is a little bit cooler. The moisture is usually there. We have had some dry ones a handful of times, but the moisture is usually there, and we have a lot less weed pressure. And so because they already have a really thinning pasture stand, they terminate it in the spring, put in that warm season annual, get a good crop off of it where they normally wouldn't have, and then they can plant in a new perennial pasture. Does that all make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah. So you wouldn't be going with a system where you have annuals every year for an extended amount of time.
Some people do. And so I know some folks who will rotate through, and this is usually on a larger amount of acreage, where they'll rotate through different paddocks, and every year that one paddock gets an annual in it, whether it's the same one all the time. Now that requires a lot of extensive nutrient requirements, because it's like doing corn on corn on corn. You have to really put the inputs to it or spread manure on it to get good nutritive value there in the soil. So some folks will do annuals on the same plot of land all the time. And then there are some folks who just simply rotate sections of their perennial fields out little bits at a time every single year. And so that's just a management style that some folks have.
All right. Okay. So there's cool season annuals, and then you can also plant in the winter. And then there's, are there any warm season options?
For planting in the winter?
Just for annuals in general.
Yeah. So some of the ones that I had talked about earlier, like the sorghum sedans, the millets, brassicas can be planted. Those are all some of our summer annuals that you can use. And then the winter annuals tend to be the things that we use as cover crops, like wheat, triticale, rye, barley, stuff like that. And so we would plant the summer annuals in usually about 2 weeks after corn is when the summer annuals will go in, and the winter annuals go in usually after silage comes off or the corn grain. If you're really trying to maximize the amount of, just to kind of put you on a calendar timeline, but to maximize the forage quantity you need, usually it needs to go in around the same time that corn silage is coming off in your area, when the soil temperatures are still at least 45 degrees.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Leanna, we have some conversation in the chat going about how best to utilize a spreadsheet, and then just on the whole thinking about optimizing grazing for parasite load. So do you want to just touch base on some of that, especially, some of our small ruminants, and how you think it's best to manage those pieces?
Yes, I can try. I have a colleague in my office who specializes in sheep and goat production, and these are questions I usually toss to her because she knows the exact dates and temperatures and rotation and all that. So I do know, so the short rest periods would conflict, yes. Something you'll have to keep in mind is how many paddocks you have. And so you may be letting some of those fields rest longer than others. Something that also helps is grazing multiple species if you have that option. I know some people don't. It's just something we toss out there because that tends to kind of eliminate that parasite cycle. I don't know that I know how to answer that 100% effectively because that's not my area of expertise, and I don't want to say something incorrect and unsafe. But I could potentially find the answer out. If I have the contact information, I'd be happy to reach out again.
Yeah, that would be great. And a little bit more to elaborate a little bit, there's some question of, is there a way to utilize the spreadsheet to change some of the pasture rest periods so that you can, make it more dynamic within the use of that spreadsheet?
I think you could play with it a little bit. Change these rest periods here to be different values. I think so. If we're wanting to break up that cycle, maybe jumping to a 30 or 60-day rest instead. That being said, though, you're going to need more paddocks, you're going to need more acreage. And so that may be that scenario where we need to either decrease our livestock numbers or we need to start looking for ways to lease more land so that we have that ability to increase that rest time, which it's challenging, I understand, but there is that balancing point between I have this finite amount of acreage to work with, but I have to utilize it effectively. So yeah.
A few other questions too, Leanna. If I want to improve diversity in my existing perennial pastures, can I interseed different perennial forages and legumes, use annuals, or should I do both?
Yes, if you want to improve your existing perennial pastures, going through and interseeding them is a good option. I always recommend I always sound like a broken record when I say it, but please soil test first, just so that you know that the seeds that you put in the ground are going to have what they need to grow effectively. But yes, if you graze nice and short before going through and doing some sort of interseeding or drilling, that's best. You can also frost seed a lot of your clovers. So at that period of time, which here in Pennsylvania, we were just kind of hitting that. And I know that because all of our sugar water was running, we were making syrup. So when your days are warm and in the 40s, 50s, and your nights drop below freezing, that's the perfect time to do some frost seeding. We recommend that mostly for our legumes because they are a nice, small, round seed. And so the whole point in that is when the ground freezes, it forms these little like honeycomb patterns. Those seeds fall nicely into those little holes. When it warms up, it like kind of falls into itself and the ground comes down and pulls up and grabs down and pulls up with that freezing and thawing and brings the seed into the ground for you. In areas where it frosts very hard in the spring, some folks have seen success with doing it with orchard grass. I don't recommend it as much because orchard grass seeds are a little longer. You just sometimes don't get that good seed to soil contact, so it's not usually recommended. It's better to no-till drill those in into a nice short sod. Like I said, you can do annuals if you want to. There is the challenge you have with if your existing sod is still too competitive for them, you might not see the emergence that you want with those annuals. You may need to increase your seeding rate a little bit to make sure you're getting as much growth as you want, understanding that some of those seeds just aren't going to germinate due to, or they may germinate and die due to competition. Like I said, it would be best to suppress that as heavily as you can before interseeding those in. I think that answered all of the different parts of that question.
I have a few more for you. So
Yeah.
we have somebody who is mostly concerned about soil compaction, and
Okay.
she's wondering, is there a trade-off with utilizing annuals? So when you're terminating your perennials and you're planting your annuals, you know, you're having a lot of equipment on those fields.
Mm-hmm.
What's the trade-off there if your main concern is compaction?
I think there is always the possibility of compaction being a concern. That no-till drill is very heavy and requires a tractor with horsepower strong enough to pull it. I always recommend if you're going to plant annuals, you need to choose a field that can handle that kind of traffic. So a lot of people will put it kind of more at the top of a hill rather than at the bottom, simply because of potential water pooling at certain periods of time. I think what's nice about usually the summer annuals is we're not overly wet at the point in time when you're trying to plant those. So it's 2 weeks after you're planting corn. So soil conditions are usually in a good spot, but I do recommend paying attention to that and making sure you're not trying to drive through fields when they're a little too soft, because you do definitely run that risk of compaction. If you do have some compacted fields, what's nice about some of those is that like a brassica or something like that, turnips, rape, they're all actually really good at trying to break up at least the surface level compaction that may occur from equipment running over the field. So if you, that's something that you could incorporate in your mix when you're doing it. So the short answer to that is yes, there is always the risk of soil compaction anytime you are running equipment over a field. I think something also to think about is if you're putting it into an existing perennial field that has good organic matter and all that good stuff, you kind of have prepped the fields to be ready for all of that hoof traffic and everything anyway, and that running equipment over the field, it should be able to tolerate it a little bit better than our fields that are more abused with some of that continuous grazing and don't have good soil structure.
Let's see, one more question that just came in. I'm trying to answer some other
No, you're good.
other chat questions. Is there any success with frost seeding forage plantain? Do you have any experience with that?
I don't personally, but I don't see, I'm thinking, because I'm not 100% sure if it would tolerate the cooler, it should. I think it has a nice small seed, and I would imagine that there would be success with it, but don't quote me on that. But based on seed size and things like that, I think that and the way it acts and grows, I would suspect that it would do all right. But again, don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% without checking first.
All right, that's all we have at this point in there. So